The golden rule is closely associated with Jesus Christ, or Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth. The golden rule states, do to others what you want them to do to you, or do not do to others what you want them to not do to you. There are these two versions of it. The negative version, do not do to others what you want them not to do to you, and the positive version, do to others or do for others what you want them to do to you or for you. Jesus says this, and it's recorded in the New Testament. He also says, love your neighbor as yourself. And this is a closely associated principle. If you sit down and think about it, you might think they're the same principle. They're certainly closely related. Now, the golden rule, Jesus says, summarizes the entire Old Testament. And he is not actually the first person to give us the golden rule. He just gives it in the way that is best known to the most people, and he gives it with the most authority. But it predates him in human history. A Jewish rabbi, Rabbi Hillel, had given the negative version of the golden rule shortly before Jesus and had claimed that it summarized the entire Torah. But the golden rule is found elsewhere. In a number of philosophers, the golden rule turns up. This is not an exhaustive survey, a very brief introduction to a few of them. Confucius, the ancient Chinese philosopher, is fairly well known for giving us the golden rule. What he gives us is the negative golden rule. Do not do to others what you want them not to do to you. But wait, there's a little more. He also gives us a particular positive version of the golden rule, just not a universal one. Or maybe I should say he hints at the positive golden rule. So he says, as a general rule, as a universal rule, do not do to others what you want them not to do to you. But he also says, in some specific circumstances, do to others what you want them to do to you. Let me quote him. The man of perfect virtue, wishing to be established himself, seeks also to establish others. Wishing to be enlarged himself, he seeks also to enlarge others. And again, elsewhere, Confucius says, I will not be afflicted at men's not knowing me. I will be afflicted that I do not know men. Here you have implicitly the principle that you should do to others what you want them to do to you. Not only that you should not do to them what you want them not to do to you, but you should do to them what you want them to do to you, at least when it comes to being established, being enlarged, and being known or understood. Now, I have to admit that as far as I'm aware, Confucius never states the positive version of the golden rule in a universal or general way. That is left to others. Let's jump forward in time and go to the other side of the world. 1800s, John Stuart Mill, British philosopher, teaching us utilitarianism in his book, Utilitarianism. Mill responds to the objection that his doctrine of happiness as the greatest good in life is a selfish doctrine. And he says, no, it's not a selfish doctrine. It's the happiness of all that is of significance. My happiness is no greater or no lesser than anyone else's. They're actually the same, and I should seek the happiness of everyone, and at times be prepared to sacrifice my own happiness for the happiness of others. Not that that always happens, but it could happen, and it does occasionally happen. And Mill says, this teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, when he gives us the golden rule, when he says, do to others what you want them to do to you, and when he says, love your neighbor as yourself, this is the greatest summary of my teaching of utilitarian ethics. Thus says John Stuart Mill. And then we have Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment philosopher over in Germany. Now, there is a footnote in his Groundwork for a Metaphysics of Morals where Kant says something about the golden rule. He says specifically that the negative version of the golden rule does not answer a certain question he had asked. He's looking for a certain overriding moral principle, or a certain moral principle, a moral law, or a statement of moral law that explains how we should live and that teaches us how to act in certain situations. And he says this negative version of the golden rule is not it. As far as I'm aware, he never says anything derogatory about the negative version of the golden rule or any other version, except that in this particular case, the negative version of the golden rule does not tell us exactly what we want to, does not answer the question we are asking at this time. Now, if you look at what Kant teaches, though, if you look at the content of his ethics, you'll actually find the golden rule there. There's a passage in the Groundwork for Metaphysics of Morals, where Kant says, what if we acted according to this principle? I will not harm others, and I will not help them either. I do not ask them to help me. I seek only to take care of myself and to do no harm to others. Kant says if we lived by this rule, the world would be a better place, but it doesn't satisfy the requirements of moral law. What the moral law requires is that you help others. You must be prepared to help others. Because the time will come when you need help from others, when you're afflicted by some tragedy. And moral law requires that you act according to universal principles. This is what Kant says in his Ethics. Watch my other videos to understand what Kant says in his Ethics, or to make a good effort to do so, or make a beginning of understanding them. Moral law requires that we act according to universal principles. And if you try to live by this principle, you will not be able to do it consistently, because eventually you will want someone else to help you. And this is how you should live. You should also help others. He's very close to giving us the golden rule. Now let's look at something else in Kant's Ethics. Kant is giving us what he calls the categorical imperative, which is the requirement of moral law that must always be obeyed for its own sake and not for the sake of something else. And he says there's more than one way of stating the categorical imperative. One way involves the universality of the principles we act on. Here's another way. Treat all human beings as ends in themselves and never as mere means. That is to say, while you must use people to get things you need, as I tell my students, you have to use someone as a means to the end of having food to eat. When you give money to the person at the store to buy food, you are using him as a means to the end of having food to eat. Well, that's fine. Kant doesn't want you to starve to death by never treating people as a means to an end. He means you should never treat people as only a means to an end. They are also ends in themselves. They're not just ways of getting at your purposes. They are also themselves purposes. Now, Kant says, treat all human beings at all times as ends in themselves and never merely as a means. And he says, this is how each of us thinks of ourselves. We already think of ourselves as ends in ourselves. I think of myself as an end in myself. You think of yourself as an end in yourself. We think of ourselves as bearers of moral value and the content of moral obligations, such that I should not be mistreated. I think I should not be mistreated. You think you should not be mistreated by others. And Kant says, you already think this way about yourself. You should think this way about all human beings. Now, if Kant is right, though he may not say so explicitly, to my knowledge he does not, if Kant is correct here, then the golden rule of Jesus is part of the very structure of moral law. It's part of the very nature of moral law. Kant is giving us a groundwork for a metaphysics of morals. Watch another video if you don't understand what that means. He is trying to understand the nature of moral obligation. And what he has discovered is that the very nature of moral obligation requires the golden rule. It requires that when I want others to treat me as an end in myself, that I also do the same for them. And so the golden rule occurs in Kant, Mill, and Confucius, as well as in Rabbi Hillel and Jesus of Nazareth.